Throughout history, certain physical traits have been seen as marks of the divine or the cursed. On the tobacco plantations of colonial Virginia, one such trait became the center of a mystery that would consume an entire family's wealth and sanity. In 1748, a plantation owner obsessed with signs and omens purchased a slave born with 6 fingers on each hand. Within 3 months of the slave's arrival, the master's fortune, accumulated over 2 generations, vanished without explanation. No theft was reported. No fire destroyed the records. The money simply ceased to exist, as if it had never been real at all. Local magistrates found no evidence of wrongdoing. Yet whispers spread through the county that the 6-fingered slave had brought a curse upon the household. But what if the truth was far more calculated than any superstition could explain? Before we continue with the story of the Harrove plantation and the slave known only as Silas, if you enjoy mysteries rooted in America's darkest chapters, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, and tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. Let's uncover this together. The events that unfolded in King William County would challenge everything the community believed about fate, fortune, and the lengths to which a desperate man might go to reclaim what he thought was rightfully his. King William County, Virginia, in the year 1748, was a place where fortunes were built on the backs of enslaved labor and the cultivation of tobacco. The soil was rich, dark, and loamy, the kind that stained your hands and clothes with a reddish-brown hue that never quite washed out. The climate was favorable, hot, humid summers that made the tobacco leaves grow thick and fragrant, and mild winters that allowed for year-round work. British demand for Virginia leaf was insatiable, and the colony had become the crown jewel of England's agricultural empire in the New World. The landscape itself was a patchwork of cleared fields and dense forests. The Mattapony River wound through the county like a dark ribbon, its waters brown with sediment and tannins from the surrounding woods. Along its banks, plantations had sprung up like mushrooms after rain, each one carved out of the wilderness through backbreaking labor. The forests that remained were thick with oak, pine, and cedar, their shadows deep and cool even in the height of summer. At night, the woods came alive with the sounds of creatures, the hoot of owls, the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of wolves that still roamed the Virginia wilderness. Families who had arrived in the previous century had established themselves as minor gentry. Their wealth was tied directly to the number of acres they could cultivate and the number of souls they could command. These were not the great planters of the Tidewater region with their thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves. These were middling families, comfortable but not wealthy, always striving to climb higher on the social ladder, always aware that one bad harvest or one unpaid debt could send them tumbling back down. The Hargrove family was among these. Thomas Hargrove, aged 42 in the summer of 1748, had inherited a plantation of 300 acres from his father, along with 18 enslaved workers. The plantation house was a modest 2-story structure built of brick and timber, with a wide front porch that overlooked the main fields. It was not grand, but it was solid, a testament to the family's steady rise over 2 generations. Thomas's father, William Hargrove, had arrived in Virginia in 1702 with little more than ambition and a willingness to endure the brutal work of clearing land. He had been the 3rd son of a minor gentleman in Sussex, England, with no inheritance to speak of and no prospects at home. Virginia had offered him a chance to make something of himself, and he had seized it with both hands. He had worked as an overseer for other planters, saved his money, and eventually purchased a small tract of land. Over the course of 30 years, he had expanded his holdings, acquired slaves, and built the foundation of what would become the Hargrove plantation. When William died in 1740, he left his son a thriving enterprise. Thomas, who had been raised in relative comfort, had never known the hardships his father had endured. He had been educated by a tutor, had learned to read and write, and had even spent a year in Williamsburg studying law before deciding that plantation management was more to his liking. By the time he inherited the estate, the Hargrove name carried weight in King William County. They were not the wealthiest family, but they were respected, and that was worth almost as much as money. Thomas was a man of peculiar habits, and those habits had grown more pronounced with each passing year. He kept meticulous records of every transaction, every harvest, every birth and death among the enslaved population. His study was lined with shelves containing leather-bound ledgers, each one filled with his precise, careful handwriting. He consulted almanacs before making decisions, checking the phases of the moon and the positions of the stars. He avoided travel on certain days, refused business with men whose names contained an unlucky number of letters, and would not sign a contract unless the date added up to a number he considered auspicious. His wife, Margaret, had learned to navigate his eccentricities with patience, though she often confided to her sister in letters that Thomas's superstitions had grown more pronounced with each passing year. Margaret was the daughter of a merchant in Williamsburg, and she had brought a modest dowry to the marriage. She was a practical woman, intelligent and capable, and she had hoped that marriage would temper some of Thomas's stranger beliefs. Instead, they had only intensified. The Hargroves had 3 children, 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Anne, ages 14 and 11, and a son, Thomas Jr., age 8. Elizabeth was a serious girl, dark-haired and quiet, who spent her time reading and helping her mother with the household accounts. And was more spirited, with a quick laugh and a tendency to ask questions that made adults uncomfortable. Young Thomas was a dreamer, uninterested in the practical matters of plantation management. He preferred to spend his time sketching birds and insects, collecting specimens, and reading whatever books the family could acquire from Williamsburg. His father despaired of ever making a proper planter out of him. The plantation itself was a small world unto itself. The main house stood at the center, surrounded by outbuildings, a kitchen, a smokehouse, a dairy, a stable, and a carriage house. Beyond these were the fields, stretching out in neat rows, and beyond the fields were the quarters where the enslaved workers lived. These were simple structures, built of wood and clay with dirt floors and no windows. 18 people lived in those quarters, ranging in age from infants to elderly men and women too old to work in the fields. They had names: Samuel, Rachel, Moses, Dinah, Jacob, and others, but to Thomas they were primarily units of labor, assets to be managed and accounted for in his ledgers. The overseer, a man named Garrett, was responsible for the day-to-day management of the enslaved workforce. Garrett was in his late 30s, a lean, hard man with a face weathered by years of outdoor work. He had come to Virginia from North Carolina, where he had worked on several plantations before finding employment with the Hargroves. He was efficient, ruthless when necessary, and utterly loyal to Thomas, or so Thomas believed. In the summer of 1748, Thomas Hargrove made a decision that would alter the course of his family's history. He had been reading his almanacs and consulting his charts, and he had become convinced that the coming year would be one of great fortune for him, if he could find the right sign, the right omen to unlock that fortune. He had always believed in signs. His father had dismissed such beliefs as foolishness, but Thomas had seen too many coincidences, too many patterns to dismiss them so easily. He decided to travel to Richmond to attend a slave auction, intent on purchasing additional laborers to expand his tobacco operation. Margaret had tried to dissuade him, pointing out that they already had enough workers for their current acreage, but Thomas was insistent. He believed that he was meant to find something, or someone, at that auction, and he would not be deterred. The journey to Richmond took 2 days by horse. Thomas traveled alone, leaving Garrett in charge of the plantation. The road was rough, winding through forests and across streams, and Thomas spent the nights at taverns along the way. He arrived in Richmond on a hot August afternoon, the air thick with humidity and the smell of the James River. The auction was held in the yard of a merchant named Dalton, a man known for acquiring slaves from ships arriving at the docks and reselling them at a profit. Dalton's yard was a large open space surrounded by a wooden fence, with a raised platform at one end where the slaves were displayed. A crowd of buyers had gathered, perhaps 50 men in all, ranging from wealthy planters to small farmers looking to purchase a single worker. Thomas stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the auction began. The slaves were brought out one by one, made to stand on the platform while the auctioneer described their qualities and invited bids. Thomas watched with a critical eye, evaluating each person as he would evaluate a horse or a piece of equipment. He was looking for something specific, though he could not have said exactly what. And then Silas was brought to the platform. He was a young man, perhaps 20 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of polished mahogany. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. His eyes were dark and intelligent, and they swept over the crowd with an expression that was neither defiant nor submissive, but simply observant. He wore only a pair of rough cotton trousers, his chest bare, and his body bore the scars of hard labor, old whip marks on his back, calluses on his hands and feet. But it was his hands that drew Thomas's attention. Silas had 6 fingers on each hand. The extra digits were fully formed, functional, and symmetrical. They were not deformities in the traditional sense, but rather an anomaly that made his hands appear almost otherworldly. Each hand had a normal thumb, 4 normal fingers, and then an additional finger between the pinky and the ring finger. The extra fingers moved with the same dexterity as the others, and Silas used them naturally, without any apparent difficulty. The auctioneer made no mention of this trait, perhaps hoping to avoid drawing attention to it, but Thomas noticed immediately. He stood frozen, staring at the man's hands as the bidding began. His heart was pounding, and his mind was racing. He had read about polydactyly in one of his books, a medical text he had acquired from a physician in Williamsburg. The book had described it as a rare condition, occurring in perhaps 1 in every 1,000 births. Some cultures, the book had noted, considered it a sign of divine favor. Others saw it as a mark of the devil. Thomas saw it as a sign. He believed, with a certainty that bordered on religious conviction, that Silas's 6 fingers were a mark of extraordinary fortune, a living talisman that would bring prosperity to his household. The number 12, the total number of fingers, was significant in numerology. It was the number of the apostles, the number of months in a year, the number of hours on a clock. It was a number of completion, of perfection. He bid aggressively, driving the price higher than he had intended to spend. Other buyers, noting his fervor, began to whisper among themselves. Some assumed Thomas knew something they did not. Perhaps Silas had some special skill or training that made him valuable. Others thought him a fool, overpaying for a slave with a physical oddity that might make him less desirable to future buyers. The bidding climbed higher and higher. Thomas could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, could hear the murmurs of speculation, but he did not care. He was convinced that this was the sign he had been waiting for, the key to unlocking the fortune that the stars had promised him. When the gavel fell, Thomas had purchased Silas for the sum of £85, nearly a quarter of his liquid assets and far more than he had ever paid for a single slave. The auctioneer looked pleased. Dalton the merchant looked amused. And Silas, standing on the platform with his hands at his sides, looked at Thomas with an expression that was impossible to read. Thomas paid in cash, counting out the coins with trembling hands. He was given a bill of sale, a simple document that transferred ownership of Silas from Dalton to Thomas Hargrove. The transaction was complete. Silas was his. Margaret was horrified when she learned what her husband had done. She had accompanied him to Richmond, but had remained at the inn, uninterested in the grim proceedings of the auction. When Thomas returned with Silas in tow, she saw immediately the cause of her husband's excitement and felt a cold dread settle in her chest. "Thomas, what have you done?" she asked, her voice low so the children would not hear. "I have secured our future," Thomas replied, his eyes bright with conviction. "This man is a sign, Margaret. 6 fingers on each hand. Do you know what that means?" "It means he is a man like any other, with an unusual birth," Margaret said. "It means nothing more." "You are wrong," Thomas said, his voice rising. "This is Providence. I have been waiting for a sign, and this is it. With him, our fortunes will rise. I am certain of it." Margaret looked at Silas, who stood silently behind Thomas, his expression neutral. She felt a pang of pity for the man, who had been purchased like a piece of livestock and was now the object of her husband's bizarre obsession. But she also felt a growing sense of unease. She had seen Thomas's superstitions lead him astray before, but never to this extent. "How much did you pay for him?" she asked. Thomas hesitated, then named the sum. Margaret's face went pale. "Thomas, that is nearly a quarter of our savings." We cannot afford not to," Thomas interrupted. "This is an investment, Margaret. You will see. Within a year, we will have doubled our wealth. Within 2 years, we will be among the wealthiest families in the county." Margaret said nothing more. She knew that arguing with Thomas when he was in this state was futile. She could only hope that his obsession would fade with time, and that the damage would not be too severe. They returned to the plantation the following day. Silas rode in the back of the wagon, his hands bound, not because Thomas feared he would run, but because it was the custom. When they arrived, Thomas brought Silas to the quarters and introduced him to the other enslaved workers. The reaction was mixed. Some were curious about the new arrival, others were wary. When they saw his hands, the whispers began. "He got the devil's mark," one woman muttered. "No, that's a blessing," another said. "My grandmother told me about people born like that. They got power." "Power for what?" a third voice asked. "Ain't no power going to save him from the fields." Garrett, the overseer, was more pragmatic. He looked Silas up and down, evaluating him as he would any new worker. "He looks strong enough. Put him with the crew clearing the north field. We'll see what he can do." But Thomas had other plans. He ordered that Silas be given a small cabin of his own, separate from the communal quarters where the other workers slept. This decision caused immediate resentment among the enslaved population, who saw it as favoritism, and confusion among the overseers, who did not understand why this particular man warranted special treatment. The cabin was a simple structure, barely large enough for a bed and a small table, but it was private, a luxury that none of the other enslaved workers enjoyed. Thomas also ordered that Silas be given better rations than the others, more meat, more bread, and even occasional luxuries like molasses or dried fruit. "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked, watching as Thomas supervised the preparation of Silas's cabin. "Because he is special," Thomas said. "He must be kept in good health and good spirits. His fortune is our fortune." Margaret shook her head but said nothing. She could see that her husband was beyond reason. Thomas began to consult Silas on matters that had nothing to do with field work. He would summon him to the main house and ask him to touch certain objects before they were used, believing that the contact of those 12 fingers would imbue them with good fortune. He had Silas stand in the doorway of the main house on the morning of important business meetings, convinced that his presence would ensure success. He even, on one occasion, asked Silas to hold a pouch of coins overnight, convinced that the money would multiply. Silas, for his part, said little. He performed the tasks assigned to him without complaint, but his expression remained unreadable. He worked in the fields when ordered, but he also spent hours in his cabin alone. The other enslaved workers began to avoid him, unsure whether he was complicit in Thomas's strange rituals or simply a victim of them. Some whispered that Silas was a conjurer, that he possessed knowledge of roots and herbs that could bring fortune or ruin. Others believed he was cursed, and that Thomas's obsession would bring disaster upon them all. A few, like Samuel, an older man who had been with the Hargroves since Thomas's father's time, simply felt sorry for him. "That man didn't ask for none of this," Samuel said one evening, sitting outside the quarters with a group of other workers. "Master got it in his head that Silas is some kind of charm, and now Silas got to live with that. Ain't right." "Ain't right, but ain't nothing we can do about it," another man replied. "Just keep your head down and stay out of it." Margaret watched her husband's behavior with growing alarm. She confided in her sister through letters, describing Thomas's fixation on Silas and his increasingly erratic decisions. She wrote that Thomas had begun to neglect the practical management of the plantation, spending hours in his study, poring over books of numerology and astrology, trying to determine the most auspicious times to plant, to harvest, to sell. He has become obsessed, she wrote. He speaks of nothing but signs and omens. He believes that this slave Silas is the key to our fortune, and he will not hear any argument to the contrary. I fear for his sanity, and I fear for our family's future. Her sister wrote back, urging her to seek help, perhaps from a physician or from the local minister. But Margaret knew that Thomas would never agree to such a thing. He would see it as a betrayal, and it would only drive him deeper into his obsession. And then, in the autumn of 1748, something began to go wrong. It started with the ledgers. Thomas Hargrove kept detailed financial records in a series of leather-bound books that he stored in a locked cabinet in his study. Each entry was written in his precise hand, the date, the nature of the transaction, the amount, and any relevant notes. He had maintained this system for 8 years, and it had served him well. He could at any moment tell you exactly how much money he had, where it was invested, and what debts were owed to him. The study itself was Thomas's sanctuary. It was a small room on the second floor of the main house, with a single window that looked out over the fields. The walls were lined with shelves containing not only the ledgers but also books on agriculture, medicine, law, and various esoteric subjects. There was a large oak desk in the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, quills, and inkwells. A locked cabinet stood in the corner, containing the strongbox where Thomas kept his cash reserves. On the morning of October 12, 1748, Thomas sat down at his desk to review the accounts before meeting with a buyer from Williamsburg who was interested in purchasing a portion of the tobacco crop. The meeting was important. The buyer, a merchant named Lawson, was known for paying fair prices, and Thomas was hoping to secure a deal that would bring in a substantial sum. He opened the ledger to the most recent entries and began to read. Almost immediately, he frowned. Something was wrong. The numbers did not match his memory. At first, he assumed he had made an error in transcription. He went back through the previous weeks, checking each entry against the receipts and notes he had saved. But the more he looked, the more confused he became. Transactions he remembered clearly were not recorded. Amounts that should have been in the hundreds were listed in the tens. Entire pages seemed to be missing, though there was no evidence that they had been torn out. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He checked the ledger again, more carefully this time, comparing each entry to his memory. But the discrepancies remained. He called for Margaret, his voice tight with panic. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a page. "This entry here, I sold 2 hogsheads of tobacco to Mercer in August. I remember it clearly. We agreed on a price of £40. But the ledger says I sold only 1 hogshead, and for £20. Margaret leaned over his shoulder, her brow furrowed. She could see the entry, written in Thomas's own hand. "Perhaps you recorded it incorrectly at the time," she suggested gently. "I did not," Thomas insisted, his voice rising. "I am meticulous. You know this. I would not make such an error." "Then perhaps Mercer only purchased 1 hogshead, and you are misremembering." "I am not misremembering," Thomas shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. "I was there. I negotiated the deal. I watched the hogsheads loaded onto his wagon. There were 2 of them, not 1. Margaret stepped back, startled by his vehemence. "Thomas, please calm yourself. Perhaps if you speak to Mercer, I will speak to no one until I understand what has happened here," Thomas said, his voice shaking. He turned back to the ledger, his hands trembling as he turned the pages. He spent the rest of the day going through the ledgers, cross-referencing every entry with the physical evidence he could find, receipts, letters, notes from buyers. The more he searched, the more discrepancies he found. It was as if the records had been altered, but there was no sign of tampering. The ink was his own, the handwriting unmistakably his, and yet the information was wrong. By evening, Thomas was in a state of near hysteria. He summoned the plantation's overseer, Garrett, and demanded to know if anyone had entered his study without permission. Garrett, a blunt and practical man, assured him that no one had. "The study is kept locked, sir. You hold the only key. No one has been in there but you." "Then how do you explain this?" Thomas shouted, thrusting the ledger at him. Garrett looked at the pages, his expression unreadable. He could see the entries, but he had no way of knowing whether they were correct or not. "I cannot explain it, sir. But if I may say so, you have been under considerable strain these past months. Perhaps you are mistaken about what you recorded." Thomas dismissed him angrily and returned to his desk. He sat there late into the night, staring at the ledgers, trying to make sense of what had happened. Margaret brought him tea, which he did not drink, and urged him to come to bed, which he refused. "I must understand this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "There must be an explanation." The next morning, Thomas went to the locked cabinet where he kept his cash reserves. The Hargrove family, like many plantation owners, kept a portion of their wealth in physical currency stored in a strongbox. This was a safeguard against the uncertainties of the colonial economy, where credit could be unreliable and banks were few and far between. Thomas had counted the money only 2 weeks prior, on the 1st of October, and he knew the exact amount, £473 sterling, along with a smaller sum in colonial script. He unlocked the cabinet with shaking hands, removed the strongbox, and placed it on his desk. The box was made of iron, with a heavy lock that required a separate key. Thomas kept that key on a chain around his neck, never letting it out of his sight. He unlocked the strongbox and opened it. The money was still there, but the amount was wrong. He counted it once, his fingers fumbling with the coins and notes. Then he counted it again, and then a third time, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. There were only £212. More than half of the cash was missing. Thomas's mind raced. He looked around the study as if expecting to find the missing money lying on the floor or tucked behind a book, but there was nothing. He checked the strongbox again, running his hands along the inside, searching for a hidden compartment or some explanation for the missing funds, but the box was solid, with no secret spaces. He sat down heavily in his chair, his face ashen. This was impossible. The strongbox had been locked. The cabinet had been locked. The study had been locked. No one had access but him. And yet the money was gone. He called for Margaret again, and this time his voice was barely above a whisper. "The money," he said when she entered. "It's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "Half of it." "More than half. I counted it 2 weeks ago. There were £473. Now there are only 212. Margaret stared at him, her face pale. "That's not possible." "I know it's not possible," Thomas shouted, his voice breaking. "But it's true. The money is gone." Margaret looked at the strongbox, then at her husband. She could see the terror in his eyes, and she felt a cold fear settle in her own chest. "Who has access to the study?" she asked. "No one. Only me. I have the only key to the study and the only key to the strongbox." "Then where could the money have gone?" "I don't know," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "I don't know." Over the following days, Thomas questioned everyone in the household. He interrogated Margaret, though she had no access to the study and no knowledge of where he kept the strongbox key. He questioned the children, though they were too young to have any involvement. He questioned the house servants, 2 women who cooked and cleaned, and a boy who tended the fires and ran errands. He questioned Garrett and the other overseers. He even questioned some of the enslaved workers, though they had no access to the main house, let alone the study. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. No one had any explanation. Thomas began to suspect that he was losing his mind. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember every detail of the past few weeks. Had he spent the money and forgotten? Had he moved it somewhere else? But he could find no evidence of either. His memory, usually so precise, seemed to be failing him. And then the situation worsened. Thomas discovered that debts he thought had been paid were still outstanding. A creditor named Larson came to the plantation demanding payment for a loan that Thomas had no memory of taking. When Thomas insisted that he had already paid the debt, Larson produced a promissory note signed in Thomas's own hand, showing that the debt was still owed. "This is impossible," Thomas said, staring at the note. "I paid you in September. I remember it clearly." "You did not, sir," Larson said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I have been waiting for payment for 3 months. If you cannot pay, I will be forced to take legal action." Thomas paid the debt using some of the remaining cash from the strongbox. But he was shaken. He had no memory of signing the promissory note, no memory of borrowing the money. It was as if entire portions of his life were being erased. Other problems began to surface. Buyers he believed he had agreements with claimed they had never finalized the transactions. His tobacco crop, which he had expected to sell for a substantial sum, fetched far less than anticipated because, according to the buyers, the quality was not what Thomas had promised. Some of the hogsheads contained leaves that were poorly cured, or mixed with inferior grades, or damaged by moisture. Thomas was baffled. He had overseen the curing process himself, or so he thought. But when he went to inspect the tobacco stores, he found that Garrett's records did not match his own. According to Garrett, several hogsheads had been damaged by a leak in the roof of the curing barn, and Thomas had ordered them to be sold at a discount. Thomas had no memory of this. "Are you certain I gave that order?" Thomas asked Garrett. "Yes, sir. You came to the barn in late September and inspected the damage yourself. You said we should sell what we could and take the loss." "I don't remember that," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Garrett looked at him with concern. "Sir, are you feeling well? You've seemed distracted lately." "I am fine," Thomas snapped, but he knew he was not fine. Something was terribly wrong, and he did not know what. Margaret, desperate to understand what was happening, began to keep her own records, noting every transaction and every conversation. She found that Thomas's memory of events often differed from what others remembered. When she gently suggested that he might be mistaken, he flew into a rage, accusing her of conspiring against him. "You think I'm mad, don't you?" he shouted one evening after she had questioned his recollection of a conversation with a buyer. "I think you are under a great deal of stress," Margaret said carefully. "And I think that stress is affecting your memory." "My memory is fine," Thomas roared. "It's everyone else who is lying." Or perhaps, he trailed off, his eyes widening. "Perhaps it's him." "Who?" "Silas. The six-fingered man. He's done this. He's cursed me." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Thomas, that's absurd. Silas is just a man. He has no power to, he has 12 fingers, Thomas interrupted, his voice rising. 12. That's a powerful number. He's used it against me. He's stolen my fortune, or hidden it, or made me forget where it is. I don't know how, but I know it's him. Thomas, please listen to yourself. You're not making sense." But Thomas was beyond listening. He stormed out of the room, leaving Margaret alone with her fears. The enslaved workers on the plantation began to notice the change in their master's behavior. He became erratic, unpredictable. He would order work to be done, and then the next day insist that he had given no such order. He accused the overseers of stealing from him, though he could provide no evidence. He began to spend hours alone in his study, poring over the ledgers, muttering to himself. And through it all, Silas remained a silent presence. Thomas's obsession with him had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified. He began to blame Silas for the financial troubles, convinced that the six-fingered man had somehow cursed him. But he also believed that Silas held the key to reversing the curse, and Southwest He kept him close, demanding that he perform increasingly bizarre rituals. One evening in late November, Thomas summoned Silas to the main house. Margaret and the children had retired for the night, and the house was quiet. The only sounds were the creak of the floorboards and the distant hoot of an owl in the woods. Thomas led Silas into the study and closed the door, locking it behind them. "You have done this," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. He stood with his back to the door, blocking Silas's exit. "You have brought ruin upon my house." Silas said nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides, his expression calm. He had learned, in his years of enslavement, that silence was often the safest response. "I know what you are," Thomas continued, stepping closer. "You are a conjurer. You have used your devil's hands to steal my fortune, but I will not let you destroy me. You will undo what you have done, or I will see you hanged." Silas met Thomas's gaze and spoke for the first time since his arrival at the plantation. His voice was deep and steady, with a slight accent that suggested he had been born in Africa, not in the colonies. "I have done nothing to you, sir. Your troubles are your own." Thomas struck him across the face, a blow hard enough to split Silas's lip. Silas did not flinch. He simply wiped the blood from his mouth with one of his six-fingered hands and waited. Thomas, breathing hard, realized that violence would not give him the answers he sought. He stared at Silas, at those 12 fingers, and felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had been so certain that Silas was the key to his fortune. But now he wondered if he had been wrong. Perhaps Silas was not a blessing, but a curse. He dismissed Silas and sat alone in the study, staring at the ledgers, trying to understand how his life had come to this. He had been a successful planter, a respected member of the community, and now he was on the verge of ruin, and he did not know why. By December, the Hargrove family's financial situation had become dire. Thomas could not pay his debts. Creditors began to circle, demanding payment. Some were patient, willing to extend credit in the hope that Thomas would recover. Others were less forgiving, threatening legal action if they were not paid immediately. The plantation, which had been prosperous for decades, was on the verge of collapse. The enslaved workers could sense the tension, and it affected their work. Productivity declined. Accidents became more frequent. The atmosphere on the plantation was one of fear and uncertainty. And then, on the night of December 15, 1748, something happened that would change everything. The fire started in the study. It was past midnight when Margaret woke to the smell of smoke. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard the crackle of flames, and she sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding. "Thomas," she shouted, shaking her husband awake. "Thomas, wake up. There's a fire." Thomas jerked awake, disoriented. For a moment, he didn't understand what was happening. Then he smelled the smoke, and terror seized him. They rushed out of the bedroom and into the hallway. Smoke was pouring up the stairs from the first floor, thick and acrid. Margaret ran to the children's rooms, waking them and herding them toward the stairs. Elizabeth and Anne were crying, and young Thomas was coughing, his eyes streaming. "Get them outside," Thomas shouted to Margaret. "I'll get the servants." Margaret led the children down the stairs, through the smoke, and out the front door. The cool night air was a shock after the heat of the house. She looked back and saw flames flickering in the windows of the study. Thomas roused the house servants and sent them running for help. Within minutes, the enslaved workers from the fields came running with buckets, forming a line from the well to the house. They worked frantically, passing buckets of water hand to hand, throwing the water onto the flames, but the fire had taken hold. The study was on the second floor, and the flames were spreading to the roof. The heat was intense, and the smoke was so thick that it was difficult to breathe. Garrett arrived, shouting orders, organizing the workers into a more efficient line. Silas was among them, his six-fingered hands moving with the same speed and dexterity as anyone else's. He worked without speaking, his face grim. It took nearly an hour to bring the fire under control. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, the study was destroyed. The roof had partially collapsed, and the walls were blackened with soot. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, and the ground around the house was muddy with spilled water. Thomas stood in the ruins, his face blackened with soot, and wept. Everything in the study was gone. The ledgers, the books, the papers, all reduced to ash. The strongbox, though intact, had been exposed to the intense heat, and when Thomas opened it, he found that the remaining cash had been reduced to charred fragments. Every record of the Hargrove family's finances had been destroyed. Margaret stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, but she did not know what to say. The children huddled together on the front porch, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale with shock. The magistrate, a man named Whitfield, was summoned to investigate. He arrived the next morning, a tall, thin man with a stern face and a reputation for fairness. He questioned everyone in the household, starting with Thomas and Margaret, then moving on to the servants and the overseers. "Can you tell me what happened?" Whitfield asked Thomas. "I don't know," Thomas said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "I was asleep. Margaret woke me, and the study was already on fire." "Was there a candle burning in the study?" I don't remember. I may have left one burning. I was working late." "Do you often work late?" "Yes, I've been trying to sort out my accounts. There have been discrepancies." Whitfield made a note of this. Discrepancies. Thomas hesitated, then explained about the missing money, the altered ledgers, the debts he didn't remember. As he spoke, he could see the skepticism in Whitfield's eyes. "And you believe someone tampered with your records?" Whitfield asked. "I don't know what to believe," Thomas said. "But yes, I think someone did." "Who had access to your study?" "No one. Only me. I kept it locked." "And the key?" "I kept it with me at all times." Whitfield questioned the servants and the overseers. None of them had seen or heard anything unusual before the fire. Garrett confirmed that the study was always kept locked and that Thomas was the only one with a key. "What about the slave, Silas?" Whitfield asked. "I understand he's been the subject of some unusual attention from you." Thomas's face flushed. "Silas had nothing to do with this." "Are you certain? You just told me you believe someone has been tampering with your records. Could it have been him?" "Silas has no access to the study. He can't read or write. How could he have altered the ledgers? Perhaps he had help. Or perhaps he started the fire to destroy the evidence." Thomas shook his head. "No. Silas was in his cabin when the fire started. I'm certain of it." Whitfield questioned Silas, who confirmed that he had been in his cabin and had come running when he heard the alarm. Several other enslaved workers corroborated this. After a thorough investigation, Whitfield concluded that the fire had been accidental, likely caused by a candle left burning too close to the ledgers. Thomas, he noted, had been spending long hours in the study and had been in a state of considerable distress. It was not difficult to imagine that he had been careless. "I understand you've been under a great deal of strain," Whitfield said to Thomas. "Financial troubles can weigh heavily on a man. It's possible that in your distraction, you left a candle burning." "I don't remember leaving a candle burning," Thomas insisted. "But you admit you may have." I suppose it's possible." Whitfield closed his notebook. "Then I'm ruling this an accidental fire. I see no evidence of arson or foul play. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Hargrove. I hope you're able to rebuild." Thomas wanted to protest, to insist that someone had set the fire deliberately, but he had no evidence, and he was beginning to doubt his own memory. Perhaps he had left a candle burning. Perhaps he had been so distracted by his obsession with the ledgers that he had been careless. Whitfield left, and Thomas was left with nothing. No records, no cash, and a plantation that was rapidly falling into debt. In the months that followed, the Hargrove family's decline accelerated. Thomas sold parcels of land to pay his creditors. He sold enslaved workers, including some who had been with the family for years. Samuel, the older man who had felt sorry for Silas, was sold to a planter in the next county. Rachel and her children were sold to a merchant in Richmond. One by one, the people who had worked the Hargrove plantation were dispersed, their families torn apart. Margaret's jewelry, which had been passed down from her mother, was sold. The children's education was halted. Elizabeth, who had dreamed of attending a finishing school in Williamsburg, was told that there was no money for such luxuries. Young Thomas's books were sold, and he was put to work in the fields, learning the practical skills his father had once hoped he would never need. The once prosperous plantation became a shadow of its former self. The fields, which had once been meticulously maintained, grew wild with weeds. The outbuildings fell into disrepair. The main house, damaged by the fire, was patched but never fully restored. And through it all, Silas remained. Thomas could not bring himself to sell Silas, despite the fact that he blamed him for everything. He was convinced that Silas held the secret to recovering the lost fortune, and he clung to this belief with the desperation of a drowning man. Margaret, meanwhile, had begun to form her own theory about what had happened. She had watched her husband's descent into obsession and madness, and she had seen the way his grip on reality had loosened. She believed that Thomas had destroyed his own fortune, not through any curse or conjuring, but through his own erratic behavior and poor decisions. She believed that he had mismanaged the accounts, made bad deals, and then, unable to face the truth, had convinced himself that he was the victim of some supernatural force. But she kept these thoughts to herself. To voice them would be to accuse her husband of madness. And in a society where a woman's security depended entirely on her husband's stability, such an accusation could be ruinous. By the spring of 1749, the Hargrove plantation was on the verge of foreclosure. Thomas had exhausted every avenue of credit, and his creditors were preparing to seize the property. The family faced the very real possibility of losing everything: the land, the house, their social standing, everything that William Hargrove had worked so hard to build. It was at this point that something unexpected happened. A letter arrived from a lawyer in Williamsburg, informing Thomas that a distant relative, a cousin he had barely known, had died and left him a modest inheritance. The cousin, a merchant who had never married and had no children, had named Thomas as his heir. The amount was not large, perhaps £200, but it was enough to pay off the most pressing debts and keep the plantation afloat for a while longer. Thomas saw this as a sign. He believed that his faith in Silas had finally been rewarded, that the curse had been lifted. He summoned Silas to the house and, in a moment of bizarre gratitude, offered him his freedom. Silas, who had endured months of Thomas's accusations and abuse, looked at the men with an expression that might have been pity. "I do not want your freedom," Silas said. Thomas was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "Every slave wants his freedom." "I want the truth," Silas said. "The truth? What truth?" "You know what happened to your fortune," Silas said, his voice steady. "You know, and you have blamed me to avoid facing it." Thomas's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Silas said. "You know, and it terrifies you." Thomas ordered Silas out of the house and never spoke to him again. But Silas's words haunted him. Deep down, Thomas knew that Silas was right. He knew what had happened to his fortune. He just couldn't bring himself to admit it. The inheritance from the distant cousin provided the Hargrove family with a temporary reprieve, but it did not solve the underlying mystery of what had happened to Thomas's fortune. Margaret, who had been quietly conducting her own investigation, began to piece together a picture that was both disturbing and tragically mundane. She started by speaking to the buyers and creditors who had dealt with Thomas over the past year. She did this carefully, framing her questions as innocent inquiries about business matters, so as not to arouse suspicion or damage what little remained of the family's reputation. What she learned was illuminating and deeply troubling. Several buyers reported that Thomas had approached them with offers to sell tobacco at prices far below market value. When they had agreed, Thomas had later claimed that he had never made such offers and accused them of trying to cheat him. In some cases, he had delivered tobacco of poor quality, insisting that it was the premium leaf he had promised. In other cases, he had failed to deliver at all and then denied that any agreement had been made. One buyer, a merchant named Carlyle, told Margaret a particularly disturbing story. He said that Thomas had come to his warehouse in Richmond in September, offering to sell 10 hogsheads of tobacco at a very low price. Carlyle, sensing an opportunity, had agreed immediately and paid Thomas in cash. But when Carlyle's men arrived at the Hargrove plantation to collect the tobacco, Thomas had flown into a rage, insisting that he had never made such a deal and accusing Carlyle of trying to steal from him. "I showed him the receipt, signed in his own hand," Carlyle told Margaret, "but he insisted it was a forgery. He threatened to have me arrested. I had to leave without the tobacco, and I lost the money I had paid him." Margaret was horrified. "Did you take legal action?" "I considered it," Carlyle said. "But I heard that your husband was having difficulties. I didn't want to add to his troubles. I wrote off the loss and decided to have no further dealings with him." Margaret thanked him and moved on to the next creditor. The pattern was the same everywhere she looked. Thomas had made agreements, taken money, and then denied that any transaction had occurred. He had borrowed money and then insisted that the debts had been paid. He had sold goods and then claimed that they had been stolen. One creditor, a man named Larson, told Margaret that Thomas had borrowed a significant sum of money in August, and then weeks later had come to him insisting that the debt had already been paid. When Larson produced the promissory note, Thomas had flown into a rage, claiming that the note was a forgery. "I've known your husband for 10 years, Larson said. He's always been a bit peculiar, but this was different. He genuinely seemed to believe that he had paid me, even though I had the note right there in front of him. It was as if he was living in a different reality." Margaret also spoke to Garrett, the overseer, who had been with the family for years. Garrett was reluctant to speak ill of his employer, but when pressed, he admitted that Thomas's behavior had become increasingly erratic over the past year. "He would give me orders one day, and then the next day he would insist that he had given completely different orders," Garrett said. "He would forget conversations we had just had. He would accuse me of things I hadn't done. I started keeping my own records just to protect myself." "May I see those records?" Margaret asked. Garrett hesitated, then nodded. He went to his cabin and returned with a leather satchel. Inside were ledgers similar to the ones Thomas had kept, but with different entries. Margaret opened them and began to read. What she found was a detailed account of the plantation's operations over the past year, including notes on Thomas's behavior. Garrett had recorded every order Thomas had given, every conversation they had had, every transaction that had been made. The records painted a picture of a man whose mind was deteriorating, who could not remember what he had done or said from one day to the next. But there was something else in the ledgers, something that made Margaret's blood run cold. Garrett had been skimming money from the plantation. The entries were carefully disguised, hidden among the legitimate transactions. But once Margaret knew what to look for, they were unmistakable. Small amounts taken regularly over the course of months, adding up to a substantial sum. Margaret looked up at Garrett, her face pale. "You've been stealing from us." Garrett's expression didn't change. "I've been taking what I'm owed." "What you're owed?" "You're paid a salary." "A salary that barely covers my expenses," Garrett said. "I've worked for your family for 5 years, Mrs. Hargrove. I've kept this plantation running while your husband lost his mind. I've dealt with his accusations, his paranoia, his impossible demands. I earned that money." "You stole it," Margaret said, her voice shaking with anger. Call it what you like, Garrett said. But I'm not the one who destroyed this family. Your husband did that all on his own. Margaret wanted to argue, to defend Thomas, but she couldn't, because she knew that Garrett was right. Thomas had destroyed the family, not through any curse or conspiracy, but through his own actions. She took the ledgers and returned to the main house. She knew what she had to do, but she dreaded it. She would have to confront Thomas with the truth, and she didn't know how he would react. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Margaret sat down with Thomas in the parlor. She laid the ledgers on the table between them. I need to show you something, she said. Thomas looked at the ledgers, his face wary. What are those? Garrett's records. He's been keeping his own account of the plantation's operations. Why would he do that? Because he didn't trust your records, Margaret said gently. And, Thomas, there's something else. Garrett has been stealing from us. Thomas's face went white. Stealing? How much? I don't know exactly, but it's a substantial amount. Enough to account for some of the missing money. Thomas grabbed the ledgers and began to read, his hands shaking. As he read, his expression changed from shock to anger to something that looked like relief. So it was him, Thomas said. It was Garrett all along. He stole from me, and then he set the fire to cover his tracks. Thomas, I don't think, it all makes sense now, Thomas interrupted, his voice rising. He had access to everything. He could have altered my ledgers, stolen the money, and then burned the study to destroy the evidence. And I blamed Silas. I blamed an innocent man. Margaret wanted to tell him that it wasn't that simple, that Garrett's theft was only part of the story. But she could see the hope in Thomas's eyes, the desperate need to believe that he was not responsible for what had happened. And she didn't have the heart to take that away from him. What do you want to do? She asked. I want to see him arrested, Thomas said. I want him to pay for what he's done. The next day, Thomas went to the magistrate and filed a complaint against Garrett. He brought the ledgers as evidence, and he gave a detailed account of the theft. Whitfield listened carefully, examined the ledgers, and then summoned Garrett to answer the charges. Garrett did not deny the theft. He admitted it openly, just as he had to Margaret. But he also told his side of the story, describing Thomas's erratic behavior, his paranoia, his inability to manage the plantation. I kept this place running, Garrett said. While Mr. Hargrove was obsessing over his six-fingered slave and his omens, I was doing the work that needed to be done. I took what I was owed, nothing more. Whitfield considered the evidence. The theft was clear, and Garrett had admitted to it. But the magistrate could also see that the situation was more complicated than a simple case of embezzlement. Mr. Garrett, Whitfield said, you have admitted to stealing from your employer. That is a serious crime. However, I also note that Mr. Hargrove's management of his affairs has been questionable. I am prepared to show leniency if you agree to make restitution. I have no money to make restitution, Garrett said. I spent what I took. Then you will work off the debt, Whitfield said. I am sentencing you to 7 years of indentured servitude. Your wages will be paid directly to Mr. Hargrove as restitution for the theft. Garrett accepted the sentence without protest. He was taken away, and Thomas was left with a hollow victory. The restitution would take years to collect, and it would amount to only a fraction of what had been stolen. The Hargrove fortune was gone, and no amount of legal action could bring it back. But Thomas clung to the belief that he had been vindicated. He told himself that Garrett had been responsible for everything, the missing money, the altered ledgers, the fire. He refused to consider the possibility that his own actions had played a role in the family's downfall. Margaret knew better. She had seen the evidence, had spoken to the buyers and creditors, had read Garrett's records. She knew that Garrett's theft was only part of the story. The rest of it, the bad deals, the forgotten transactions, the erratic behavior, that was all Thomas. But she said nothing. She had learned that there was no point in arguing with Thomas when he was determined to believe something. And perhaps she thought it was better this way. Perhaps it was better for Thomas to believe that he had been the victim of a conspiracy, rather than face the truth that he had destroyed his own fortune through his own madness. In the months following Garrett's arrest, the Hargrove plantation continued its slow decline. The inheritance from Thomas's cousin had provided a brief respite, but it was not enough to reverse the damage that had been done. The family was still deeply in debt, and creditors continued to press for payment. Thomas, however, seemed to have regained some of his old confidence. He believed that with Garrett gone, he could rebuild what had been lost. He threw himself into the work of managing the plantation, determined to prove that he was still capable. But the problems persisted. Crops failed. Workers fell ill. Equipment broke down. It was as if the plantation itself was cursed, though Margaret knew that the real problem was much more mundane. The plantation was understaffed, underfunded, and poorly managed. Thomas, despite his renewed energy, was not the man he had once been. His judgment was still impaired, his memory still unreliable. And Silas remained. Thomas had stopped his bizarre rituals, no longer asking Silas to touch objects or stand in doorways, but he had not sold him, and he had not granted him his freedom, despite his earlier offer. Silas continued to work in the fields, a silent, enigmatic presence. Margaret had begun to feel a strange sympathy for Silas. He had been caught up in Thomas's obsession through no fault of his own, and he had endured months of abuse and suspicion. She wondered what he thought of the family, of the plantation, of the strange turn his life had taken since he had been purchased at that auction in Richmond. One afternoon, Margaret found herself alone in the yard when Silas was returning from the fields. She called to him, and he stopped, waiting for her to speak. "I need to ask you something," Margaret said, her voice steady. "About the fire." Silas regarded her with his calm, unreadable expression. "What do you wish to know? Did you set it? No, do you know who did?" Silas hesitated, and for the first time, Margaret saw something flicker in his eyes. It was not fear, but something close to it, caution, perhaps. "I know what your husband believed," Silas said. "He believed that I was a conjurer, that I had cursed him. But I'm not a conjurer, and I did not curse him. I'm simply a man who was born with an extra finger on each hand." "Then what happened to the fortune?" Margaret asked. Silas looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust her. Finally, he spoke. "Your husband destroyed it himself. Not through magic, but through his own actions. He made poor decisions, forgot what he had done, and then blamed others when things went wrong. I watched it happen. I tried to tell him, but he would not listen." "And the fire?" Silas's expression darkened. "The fire was set by someone who wanted to erase the evidence of what had really happened. Someone who knew that if the ledgers were examined closely, the truth would come out." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Who?" Silas did not answer directly. Instead, he said, "Your husband was not the only one who kept records. Garrett, the overseer, kept his own ledgers. He has them still, hidden in his quarters. If you want to know the truth, you should look at those." "I've already seen them," Margaret said. "Garrett was arrested for theft." "Then you know," Silas said. "You know what he did." "I know he stole money," Margaret said. "But are you saying he set the fire?" Silas met her gaze. "I am saying that Garrett had more to lose than anyone if the truth came out. Your husband's ledgers would have shown the discrepancies. They would have shown that money was missing. Garrett needed those ledgers destroyed." Margaret felt her heart pounding. "Do you have proof?" "No," Silas said. "Only what I saw. On the night of the fire, I was in my cabin, but I was not asleep. I heard someone moving through the yard toward the main house. I looked out, and I saw a figure. It was too dark to see clearly, but I recognized the way he moved. It was Garrett. Why didn't you say anything? Who would have believed me? Silas asked. I am a slave. My word means nothing. And Garrett knew that. He knew he could do what he wanted, and no one would suspect him. Margaret stood in silence, absorbing this information. If Silas was telling the truth, then Garrett had not only stolen from them but had also destroyed the evidence to cover his tracks. And Thomas, in his paranoia and obsession, had been too blind to see it. Thank you for telling me, Margaret said finally. Silas nodded and turned to go. But Margaret called after him, Silas, wait. Why did you stay? After everything my husband put you through, why didn't you run? Silas looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw something like sadness in his eyes. Where would I go? He asked. I am a slave. If I run, I will be caught and punished. And even if I am not caught, where would I go? I have no family, no home, no place in this world. At least here, I have a roof over my head and food to eat. It is not much, but it is something. He walked away, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. That evening, Margaret told Thomas what Silas had said. She expected him to dismiss it, to insist that Silas was lying or mistaken, but instead, Thomas listened in silence, his face growing paler with each word. Garrett set the fire, Thomas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He destroyed everything to cover his theft. It seems likely, Margaret said. Then I was right, Thomas said. I was right all along. There was a conspiracy. Someone was stealing from me, and they destroyed the evidence. Margaret wanted to tell him that it wasn't that simple, that his own actions had played a role in the family's downfall. But she could see the relief in his eyes, the desperate need to believe that he was not responsible, and she didn't have the heart to take that away from him. What do you want to do? She asked. I want to see him punished, Thomas said. He's already been sentenced for theft, but he should be punished for the fire as well. We have no proof, Margaret said. Only Silas's word, and a magistrate will not accept the testimony of a slave. Then I will find proof, Thomas said. I will not let him get away with this. But Thomas never found proof. Garrett, serving his sentence of indentured servitude on another plantation, maintained his innocence regarding the fire, and without evidence, there was nothing Thomas could do. The months passed, and the Hargrove family continued to struggle. Thomas's health began to decline. The stress of the past year had taken its toll, and he was often ill, confined to his bed with fevers and aches. Margaret took over more and more of the plantation's management, and she proved to be more capable than Thomas had ever been. Under her leadership, the plantation stabilized, though it would never again reach the heights it had once known. Thomas, meanwhile, became increasingly withdrawn. He spent his days in the parlor, staring out the window at the fields, lost in thought. He no longer spoke of omens or signs. He no longer consulted his almanacs. It was as if the fire had burned away not only his records but also his beliefs. One evening, as Margaret sat with him, he spoke for the first time in days. I was wrong, he said, his voice weak. Wrong about what? Margaret asked. About everything. About Silas. About the signs. About the fortune. I thought I could control my fate. That I could read the signs and make the right choices. But I was wrong. There are no signs. There is only chance, and luck, and the choices we make. And I made the wrong choices. Margaret took his hand. You did what you thought was right. I destroyed us, Thomas said. I destroyed everything my father built. And for what? For a belief in something that was never real. We are not destroyed, Margaret said. We are still here. The children are healthy. We have a roof over our heads. We will survive. But at what cost? Thomas asked. I sold people, Margaret. I tore families apart. I ruined our reputation. And for what? For nothing. Margaret had no answer for him. She could only sit with him in silence, holding his hand as the shadows lengthened and the night closed in. In the spring of 1750, Thomas Hargrove made one final decision. He summoned Silas to the main house, and in the presence of Margaret and a local notary, signed the papers granting Silas his freedom. "I owe you this," Thomas said, his voice weak. "I blamed you for things that were not your fault. I treated you cruelly. This is the least I can do." Silas took the papers, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply. "Where will you go?" Margaret asked. "North," Silas said. "I have heard there are free black communities in Pennsylvania. I will try to find work there, make a life for myself." "I wish you well," Margaret said. Silas nodded and turned to leave, but at the door he paused and looked back at Thomas. "You were not cursed," Silas said. "You were afraid, and fear can destroy a man more surely than any curse." He left, and Thomas never saw him again. Thomas Hargrove died in the autumn of 1753 at the age of 47. The cause of death was listed as a fever, but those who knew him believed that he had simply lost the will to live. He was buried in the family plot, and his grave was marked with a simple stone that bore his name and the dates of his birth and death, nothing more. Margaret lived for another 20 years, managing the plantation and raising her children. She never remarried. Elizabeth eventually married a merchant from Williamsburg and moved away. And married a farmer from the next county. Young Thomas, despite his early disinterest in plantation management, took over the estate when he came of age and proved to be a capable, if unambitious, manager. The plantation survived, though it was much reduced from what it had been in William Hargrove's time. The family's reputation never fully recovered, and they were never again counted among the county's elite. Margaret, in her later years, would sometimes speak of the events of 1748 and 1749, but only in the vaguest terms. She would say that her husband had been a good man who had been undone by his own fears, and that the world was full of people who would take advantage of those fears if given the chance. She never spoke of Silas, except once, to her daughter Elizabeth. Elizabeth had asked her mother what had become of the six-fingered slave, and Margaret had told her that he had been granted his freedom and had gone north. "Do you think he found what he was looking for?" Elizabeth asked. "I hope so," Margaret said. "He deserved better than what we gave him." The story of the six-fingered slave and the fortune that disappeared became a local legend, told and retold in the taverns and parlors of King William County. Some versions of the story claimed that Silas had been a conjurer, that he had cursed the Hargrove family for their cruelty. Others said that he had been innocent, a victim of circumstance and superstition. The truth, as is often the case, was more complicated than either version allowed. Thomas Hargrove had not been cursed. He had been a man of his time, shaped by the beliefs and superstitions of the 18th century. He had believed in signs and omens because he wanted to believe that the world was ordered, that there was a pattern to events, that he could control his fate if only he could read the signs correctly. But the world is not ordered. There are no signs, no omens, no patterns that can be read and understood. There is only chance, and choice, and the consequences of our actions. Thomas had made poor choices. He had become obsessed with Silas, convinced that the six-fingered man was the key to his fortune. In his obsession, he had neglected the practical management of his plantation. He had made bad deals, forgotten transactions, and alienated buyers and creditors. And when things went wrong, he had blamed others rather than face the truth that he was responsible. Garrett had taken advantage of Thomas's distraction and his deteriorating mental state. He had stolen money, and when he feared that he would be caught, he had set the fire to destroy the evidence. He had been caught eventually, but by then the damage was done. The Hargrove fortune was gone, and it could not be recovered. Silas had been innocent. He had been caught up in Thomas's obsession through no fault of his own. He had endured months of abuse and suspicion, and he had borne it with a dignity that few men could have mustered. When he was finally granted his freedom, he had left without bitterness, seeking only to make a life for himself in a world that had given him little reason to hope. What became of Silas after he left the Hargrove plantation is not known. There are no records of a six-fingered man in the free black communities of Pennsylvania, though that does not mean he did not arrive there. Perhaps he changed his name, or perhaps he settled in a place where his unusual hands were not remarked upon. Or perhaps he died on the road, another casualty of a world that was cruel to those who were different. The Hargrove plantation still stands, though it is now a private residence, and the Hargrove name has long since faded from memory. The main house has been renovated and expanded, and the fields where tobacco once grew are now planted with corn and soybeans. The quarters where the enslaved workers lived are gone, torn down decades ago, and there is no marker to indicate that they ever existed. But if you visit King William County and ask the older residents about the six-fingered slave, some will still tell you the story. They will tell you about the master who went mad, the fortune that vanished, and the fire that destroyed the evidence. And they will tell you that sometimes the things we fear the most are not curses or demons, but the truths we cannot bear to face. Thomas Hargrove feared that he was not in control of his fate. He feared that his fortune was built on sand, that it could disappear at any moment. And so he sought signs and omens, believing that if he could read them correctly, he could secure his future. But in seeking those signs, he lost sight of what was real. He neglected his business, alienated his allies, and drove himself to madness. And in the end, his fears came true. Not because of any curse or supernatural force, but because of his own actions. The fortune that disappeared overnight was not stolen by a six-fingered conjurer. It was not destroyed by a curse. It was squandered by a man who was too afraid to face reality and too proud to admit his mistakes. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying thing of all, not that the world is full of curses and demons, but that we are capable of destroying ourselves through our own fears and delusions. The story of Thomas Hargrove and Silas is a reminder that the greatest dangers we face are often not external, but internal. They are the fears we carry, the beliefs we cling to, and the truths we refuse to see. And sometimes, those dangers are more destructive than any curse could ever be. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Thomas Hargrove was a victim of his own mind? Or was there something more at play? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries rooted in history. See you in the next one.